And we're going to focus on operationalizing requirements, generation, and contracts both. And if you think about it, and what the other panel really talked about, you can't separate the two. Whatever is done in requirements, as Chris Mendoza said and General Simpson has said, you can't lose contact with that. You have to focus on the requirements, understand what it is, and not let it simply go over the brick wall. You have to be integrated as a group. So I look forward to our great panel that we have here and the discussions that we have. A reminder for all our panel members, we do have Redstone out there for all my teammates at Team Redstone. Welcome again. But also to our panel members, please make sure that you have your microphone on and you're talking into the microphone so our teammates at Redstone can hear. You can read all the bios for the panel members on the AUSA website. I'm going to quickly go through and discuss some of the highlights of each and every one of them. I'm going to save General Simpson for last, but I'll walk through all of our distinguished panel members that are here today very quickly. First is Mr. Jay Carr to my right. I've known Jay almost since 1776. Maybe not quite that long, but he is the Executive Director and Principal Assistant responsible for contracting for the Army Contracting Command at Rock Island, which, as we know, is a major contracting center. Mr. Carr supports numerous commands at Rock Island, not just Army Sustainment Command, but several PEOs, to include some at Redstone, PEO AMMO, PEO EIS. He also does great work for CENTCOM with reachback capability. And at the end of the day, he manages over $80 billion of contracts for the United States Army and critical customers. To his right is Mr. Byron Bright. He is the Senior Vice President for the Logistics Business Unit of KBR. With over 8,000 employees actively working in 16 different countries, Byron ensures delivery of some of the largest DoD support contracts in Africa, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. He currently has responsibility for the LOGCAP 4 contract for KBR. Former Air Force officer and graduate of the Air Force Academy. And to the far right is Major General Kevin Leonard. He is the Senior Vice President for Facilities and Logistics Services for Vectrus. He is responsible for development of short-term and long-term strategies for business growth and innovation. He had previously worked for Fluor Corporation. Kevin, I've known him for many years as well. He is a seasoned logistician, former Army officer that's got over 30 years of service, and most of that in critical command assignments and downrange and combat operations, where you helped me tremendously in my previous life. Mr. Julian Setian is the president and CEO of SOSi International. He has worked as a senior executive in the defense and government services sector for more than 20 years. He joined SOSi in 1995 and has been the CEO since 2001. Global Enterprise, SOSi, has over 1,000 employees across 30 countries. And to my left, and we are honored to have James Simpson here to chair this panel most appropriately. Major General James Simpson is currently the Commanding General for Army Contracting Command. And as you know, this is a multi-billion-dollar enterprise that supports not only major programs, all the PEOs, but also mission, installation, and expeditionary contracting operations around the globe. As we were talking earlier, the sun never sets on Army Contracting Command. They're somewhere around the world every day doing great things. His previous assignments include Joint Theater Support Contracting Command, OEF Afghanistan, Director of Contracting for ASALT, Senior Contracting Official in Iraq, and Commander Contracting Center of Excellence. And again, I don't think there's anyone more appropriate to be the panel chair than Major General James Simpson. Having said that, James, I'll turn it over to you for your comments.
Thank you, sir. I vividly remember the last, before you left active duty, sir, I was sitting at the Corps of Engineers, and that phone call that I got from you said, hey, he said, James, I know you just came out of Iraq, but guess what? You're going to Afghanistan. So, you know, we all get that phone call sooner or later about deploying. So I said, Roger, sir, when is the next plane leaving? But I tell you, contracting is a complex field. And, you know, when we look at some of the things that the chief is wanting to do in terms of getting stuff quicker to our soldiers and everything, it takes a culture change from all of us, especially from the Army Contracting Command. as I said earlier, a lot of my people used to waiting for stuff to drop over the wall. We no longer have that luxury for waiting for it to drop over the wall. In certain cases, as Chris Mendoza said, you got people embedded, or sometimes you just have to go over the wall or under the wall to get it now. Because if we, can I get the first slide, please? Okay, I'm sorry, number 2 then, I'm sorry. Okay, what we want to do up here is get left of bang. And that means that we all have to be able to work a year or 2 out from a requirement. And when you're working that far out, that means that you got an integrated team of contracting, the program managers, legal, the engineers, and so forth, meeting weekly, monthly to get this contracting package together so that you can meet the chief's requirement downstream. But that's the only way to do it. And then you put a good solicitation out there, and guess what? Industry bids on that solicitation, and you get a good requirement back. But the way we've been haphazardly doing things is we can't afford to work like that anymore. Because once you put a bad requirement out there, all we do is that we do modifications to the, and we keep pushing it downstream. And as taxpayers, guess who's paying for those modifications? We are. Okay? So that's what I want to impress upon you as we go here today is, as in the Army Contracting Command, it's not about dollars. I mean, I know how many dollars I can obligate yearly, but it's not about that. It's not about the number of actions that I process. Because if I can process less actions and focus on contract closeout and other things, that's a great thing for me. So I need to look at all these strategic sourcing vehicles that we have out there that are already contracts that I can piggyback off of. Okay? And that's where we have to manage our workload to make sure that we're using all our resources that are out there. And let's talk about developing requirement packages for a second. Customer training and standardization of packages. I think we've hit on that a lot today, but I want to go back to it for a second because we have a lot of templates out there. But what we have to do also is make sure the customer knows where those templates are at. And more, we got to make sure we join hands with the customer. The customer don't understand the templates that I got out there. And I need to sit down, or contract specialist need to sit down with the customer, or KO, and says, okay, this is the template for this type of service, and this is how it should fit what you're trying to do. A job of a contracting officer is to give the requiring activity the best business advice that they can give. And we got to get back to doing that. Again, that goes back to communication. We in the Army Contracting Command cannot do enough of that. We have to continue to stay focused on that. Next slide, please. And I talked about this process earlier this morning about accountability. We have to make sure that we're holding ourselves accountable in the Army Contracting Command. And I'm going to give you a good example here. Contracts that are expiring, we know that this contract for the grass cutting services on Fort Belvoir, Virginia is going to expire on the 1st of December of 2018. We know that. And we know that they're going to renew that contract. They're not going to let the grasses continue to get high, right? Okay. Then we should be working a year out to have it in my office at Mick Fort Belvoir so they can start awarding that contract. But typically what happens is we come in there about 60 days out. And you drop that and you say this is a priority. It's a priority with every other customer that the MIC supports in the National Capital Region. So what is the priority? You have to help me, the requiring activities have to help me prioritize. Get stuff in early. But that is where the contracting officer also, what we've done is we put together spreadsheets up at ACC, APG, for instance. They got a spreadsheet that goes out 5 years with 1 year, 2 year, 3 year increments. They can tell you the contract's expiring in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and 4 years. Now, and we're trying to get all of my centers like that in my MIC offices and everything. The MIC with those small offices, they're there. Brigadier General Gabbard and his team have done an excellent job of doing that on those installations, because those installations, they know what's going to expire. But we got to get that standardized across the Army Contracting Command with our customers. And then you won't have to worry about what's late. That's what I mean by holding our people accountable and making sure we're doing due diligence also. And then also, as General Perna always said, it's not about the Army Material Command or the Army Contracting Command. It's about doing what's best for our Army. And that's all it's about as far as I'm concerned. That's what we all should strive for. What is best for this great Army that we support. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, James. Jay.
Well, on behalf of the employees of Rock Island, I'd just like to thank AUSA for the opportunity to come, and I'm looking forward to talking to everybody today. As I was doing research, I'm getting feedback, as I was doing research, oh, there we go. I was looking at an article, actually it was a paper that was written by a War College student back in 2005. It's a retired Army colonel, he's since passed away. And when I was reading through it, it was amazing to me at how applicable it was to today's operation. Talked about the need to operationalize contracting, to have contractors engage with the government early on in the planning process, clearly articulate requirements, provide better oversight, all the things that are still issues today that we deal with. Now, I think we've made a lot of progress as we move forward collectively as an organization, but it just shows that over time, this has been a challenge that we've all seen and had to deal with at different levels, whether on the industry side or as commanders on the ground. And so I think one of the challenges is, as we talk about operationalizing contract, I see the centers in contracting as being able to provide that commander on the ground decision space to affect his or her operation. And by doing that, that means we do have to get to the left so that they can make operational decisions and give them the ability to manage that risk that is only their responsibility on the battlefield. And so we're trying to do that, and it's no easy task because, and I'll focus more on some of our operational contracts downrange as opposed to PEO contracts. The commander that I'm supporting that has a requirement that is expiring 2 years from now has not even been identified. They don't even know they're going downrange right now. Yet we know that we have a requirement that we have to shepherd through the process to give that commander an opportunity to be successful on the battlefield and protect the lives of all the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines that are out there. And so how do we go about doing that? And I think one of the things we've noticed is, and I've been in contracting for about 20 years, is that the requirements process, we always have said that the requirements owners don't do a very good job of articulating the requirements. And I think obviously it's not a result of them not wanting to do it. They all have a desire to do that, but they don't get the training in it. They know how to fire their tanks, they know how to fire their M16s, their M4s, but they don't get the training to write that. So I believe that we really own that process. My job, there is a requirements owner, and that is the commander on the ground, but we are the capability providers in the acquisition centers and the contractors that work with us. We are the people that provide that capability to the commanders. So we have a vested interest over that 2 year period to support that commander and do everything we can to make sure that we take off as much responsibility to get to that end state so that it's one less thing that they have to worry about on the battlefield. And I think we're doing a good job of that. I think one of the challenges, however, is obviously our process is somewhat slow. As someone told me, we always end up shooting behind the duck. We'll go out with a solicitation. 2 years later, we still haven't awarded a contract, and the enemy has continued to move forward. And so when we award the contract, we're surprised that there's a modification that's worth twice the value of the contract because we haven't been able to keep pace. And so certainly we want to work through and compress that process and go after this. But I think one of the things that they would expect from us as the commanders, we work through these requirements, is a learning curve. And I talked about this last time I was fortunate enough to talk at AUSA, is that I view it a little bit like the old days when RTEP. Commanders expect, if we issue an RFP, to me that's just like an RFF. Okay, it's a request for a capability or forces, and I view the contractors as a component of that. There's an expectation of the commander that that force, that contractor is going to come trained to be able to execute that mission and step up immediately, just like they would if it was a tank company or an MP company or some other active duty entity or reserve component entity that hit the ground. So we have to work collectively to make sure that we understand the requirements well enough so that when we do hit the ground, and we all know, and I've been called a contractor, which I consider a compliment, by a number of commanders, but commanders paint us all up here with the same brush, and we've all talked about this. There is no delineation between the government and the contractors when a commander needs a capability. They're looking at all of us to provide that. So it goes back to communication. We talked about that. But I would just say it's an honor to be up here on this panel with all these gentlemen. We've worked very closely, and I'm amazed at what the industry has done for our forces over the years. So with that, thanks, and I'll pass it over to Byron.
Byron?
Thank you very much. All right. Thank you very much. General Phillips, General Simpson, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak today. I guess my comments are similar to what you've heard. You know, we all know the global operations tempos continue to rise across vast geographies in the Middle East and the Pacific. And our budgetary demands, both foreign and domestic, you know, put a cap really on what's available to fight these contingencies, both in dollars and human capital. And then the FAR-based contracting process, you know, complicates that. I mean, it's intended to be to ensure openness and transparency and stewardship of taxpayers' dollars. But sometimes that's counter to the enemy, you know, who can be very unpredictable and dynamic. So as a contractor-government partnership, we've got to find ways to be more responsive and flexible as these new requirements emerge, or it's just going to impact readiness and degrade, which really makes the fight last longer and cost that much more. So I believe we should treat contractors as part of the total force, really embedded inside the combatant commands, and fully open book for planning activities. So I'm going to give you two areas in my comments today where I think we can improve the effectiveness of operationalizing contracting in a contingency environment. First, it's creating an open culture with contractors. And then second, it's going to be how can we support longer range planning activities. I think if we can focus on these two areas, we can really make some improvements. So my first point is about changing the culture. We've got to move from just being part of the force, we've got to move towards being part of the force and not just seen as a service provider. We've got to move from this arm's length relationship to more embedded partnerships. We have systems in place. We have DCMA approved business systems. We have DCAA who audits us. We have the Expeditionary Contracting Command. We have contract mechanisms like cost reimbursable contracts with all of the kind of open book, you know, audit process that go with that. So we as an industry and government have got to trust those systems and let that be the governance model we're in instead of this kind of back and forth and arm's length and we can't talk to you because we're scared, and we tend to manage out of fear versus trusting these systems. We've all invested lots of money to make sure they're there. So I think if we allow ourselves that trust and rely on the systems that are in place, that we can have much more open communications and create a better culture. And I think contractors can bring a lot to this operationalizing. I think we are your long-term continuity. As an example, my task order manager in Iraq, he's been in that country probably 12 years. He's opened and closed more bases in Iraq than anybody I know. We need that deep domain expertise early when we're planning the next fight, not after an RFP has gone through all the process and then drops in our lap and we have to say, well, that's not exactly how it works in Iraq. There's no supply chain there. You can't buy this material. We've got experts, industry, all of us have experts that have done this for many, many years, and somehow we've got to find a way to let industry be upfront in defining exactly those specifications. My second point is we've got to create, you know, pathways for longer range planning, and that's going to help predictability and cost control. I often hear that, you know, contingency contracts in particular are expensive, and I like to argue, no, the requirements are expensive. You know, industry should take a lot of this burden. Industry's got to do better at providing cost inputs. I think often, we're also, not exactly sure what we can share and not share. We're trying to win a contract and those kind of things. So I think if we can create that more open culture, industry can provide, options. And part of the challenge is the government budget cycle, which I think another panel is going to talk about. It's really hard to know, for commanders on the ground, it's hard to make decisions if they don't know what things cost. And we've got to do better at giving them options, and our contracting mechanisms have got to allow industry to provide multiple options, multiple prices at different levels of specifications, so that commanders have options, and we have to think through how we do that. I think one of the issues that needs review is some of this incremental funding. That drives short-term decision making, which often costs more. And I think things like leasing equipment. If it's going to be, we tend to fight the war 2 or 3 months at a time. Instead of lease equipment, instead of buying something, when we could have saved a whole lot of money. So those are the ideas, and I think we can only implement those ideas if we're much earlier in the planning process. But I think if we can focus on culture and talking and communication, as all the other panelists have said, and then getting more early in the long range planning and letting contractors advise in that process, I think we can make some real progress. So, thank you.
Thanks, Byron. Kevin?
Thanks, Bill. I'm going to try real hard not to be redundant. I liked a lot of what Byron just had to say. So as I thought about this task, operationalizing requirements generation and contracting, I said, man, that sounds a whole lot like logistics preparation of the theater, which is a term of art that is gone by the wayside. And then I said, well, logistics preparation of the theater, golly, where could I find something about that? Oh, I know, Amazon. One click, and I can get the book. And indeed, this is for a certain flag officer sitting here. This is now FM 101.10.1, Staff Officer's Field Manual, Organizational, Technical, and Logistical Data, Volume 1. I need to buy. Hey, sir, I think you helped put this together. But here's the key point, and this is for those of us who grew up using this book as a guide for the requirements process. It told us what a rifle company looked like, how many people were in it, how many guns, how much fuel, food, ammunition it might need. And we used this back in the 90s as a guide. It's now, here's what they say about it now. This work has been selected by scholars as being culturally important and is part of the knowledge base of civilization as we know it. So thanks to Amazon, we get FM 101.10. I thought about that. I said, we used to I think so, sir. I'm not sure. But logistics preparation of the theater was an idea that had been around for a while, and we used that in our deliberate planning process and other processes. And yet, over the times that we've been in this counterinsurgency from fixed bases, we've drifted away from that. So much so that Unit A is going back to, let me use Bagram. And so they've been there before, and they think, well, it's the same, we'll do the same things we did before. So we're losing that thinking process that allowed us to consider, or drove us to consider, what it was, where we were going, what it was we were going to accomplish. I contrast that, yesterday I got this in the mail. This is a land warfare paper from AUSA. Thank you, sir. Making Sense of Russian Hybrid Warfare, a brief assessment of the Russo-Ukrainian war. And it's written by a couple of young officers, and it's amazing. And it has this idea of moving at the speed of a different kind of war. We started our discussion talking about moving at the speed of war. And I would submit to you, we're anchored in the war we've been fighting. And my plea, and I'm trying not to be redundant, my plea would be we need to be thinking about not the war we're in, but the wars to come, because there will be new ones. And they're going to be different. If we believe these young officers, they're going to be very different. They're going to be hybrids. They're going to go across an entirely different space. And I would submit to you that if we're going to achieve all the things that Jay talked about, the ability to anticipate, to respond, to provide continuity, and to only improvise when we have to be integrated. Industry has to be integrated with the Army, with the services, in order to do that sort of planning and set those theaters, which is what Gus wants us to do that early. That's my pitch, a little different, but because Brian, he took all my good points. But that's all I've got. Thank you very much. Over to you, Julian.
So just to provide a little context, I mean, we're basically a mid-tier contractor, family-owned. I've held the same job basically for the last 22 years, even though the job itself has evolved quite a bit. It's the only job I've ever held. So, as a mid-tier contractor, we're like basically a small blip on the radar. I mean, I'll know when we made it when we unseat KBR as the headline sponsor of the So, we're not in much of a position to propose solutions, but we're going to poke, prod, and provoke, and hopefully give you some things to think about. But, I describe to people who sit outside the industry what it's like to work in the industry by saying, the Army hires us as experts, but then tells us exactly how to do our jobs. I mean, many of the tools already exist for making contracting more flexible, agile, and responsive. The problem is in the understanding or the lack of understanding of the FAR and DFAR, and the unwillingness to use or fear of using it to the fullest extent possible. The piece that seems to be missing, in my view, is the lack of ownership and stakeholdership of the senior commanders on the ground. The acquisition corps is very talented, but the truth is that they really do need a lot more training and a lot more mentorship. I find that the discussions about traditional versus non-traditional defense contractors to be pretty interesting. I mean, when you just consider the global capability that companies like Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Boeing, and Honeywell have, I'd put them up against any of those Silicon Valley companies anytime. I think the problem is that they tend to be siloed, just like the government is siloed. So they look a lot like the customers themselves. There's very little opportunity to sort of cross-pollinate between the capabilities that exist in those companies. Chris Brose, the majority staff director at the HASC, said something that I thought was really interesting I read recently. He said that Senate members are generally supportive of DIUX and the use of OTAs and some of these other gimmicky things that the government has come up with, but he noted that the very existence of those tools is evidence that the Pentagon acquisition system really needs a major overhaul. I mean, the truth is that there are lots of tools that are available in the FAR that aren't fully exploited currently. So to try to develop workarounds seems to be counterproductive. I mean, I learned at an AUSA discussion a week and a half ago or 2 weeks ago that there were 700 pages added to the DFAR in the last 10 years. The truth is that new regulations to try and force and manage behavior can never be good. If you just consider for a second how ironic and strange it is that the NDAA actually has to go so far as to try to mandate the agencies not to use LPTA as a determining factor in contracts in contingency environments. I mean, that's just bizarre. I mean, when you really think about the fact that most people, if you take them behind closed doors and ask them if that's the best, most important criteria, low price, they'd probably agree that it's not. So it's just a little bit bizarre that we have to regulate ourselves to conclusions that we all already sort of know and understand. So things like, FAR 206, other than full and open competition, I mean, it basically gives the authority that the Department of Defense is seeking. I mean, it really just means having the courage to actually implement some of the things that already exist in those documents that, by the way, consist of policies that are, two volumes that are this thick. There's a lot of stuff in there, lots of flexibility afforded in the system. The other thing, too, is that, the problem that OTAs attempt to address applies to other non-technical areas of contracting. I mean, I'm not really sure why nobody really addresses service contracting and talks about it in the same way they talk about technology when you just consider the amount of money that's spent on services. So, flexibility, agility, and responsiveness can come with greater commitment to contractors, for sure. Some of the things that I think are worthy of consideration are longer contract terms. One of the things I can tell you just sitting in this seat on this side of the table for the last 20 plus years is, no sooner are we awarded a contract, we're already thinking about how to position for a recompete. Is that really how you want your contractors spending their time, money, and energy? And then, of course, open dialogue with contractors. There's a lot of lip service paid to that, but is it really, truly executed? I don't know. I can tell you that it's very hard to have open, honest dialogue with our buying offices and our end user customers. Again, it's regulation for regulation's sake. Are government acquisition officials and end users and program offices really genuinely open to and listening to the things that industry is saying? I find that I find myself constantly going through this pro forma process, and I feel like a broken record, going to these industry days and so forth. It's a lot of big generalities, and when it really comes down to it, in the execution phase, very little actually works its way into final RFPs and acquisitions. And so that's just from my perspective. Do what you will with it. Requirements-based contracts, where contractors are judged based on results and outcomes versus project management skills and ability to hire people. Every government contract, from building an F-16 down to custodial services, always boils down to a big project management exercise. There's very, and this is not for lack of desire. I just really think it comes down to training and oversight. When it comes to developing requirements, I think for some reason the outcomes are never really identified the way you would want them identified as the ultimate person responsible for whatever operations being supported. That's just from our perspective. You see this, you see it just in the proposal preparation instructions. It's all the standard stuff in almost every single solicitation. It's just crazy. Hundreds and hundreds of pages of quality control plans and management plans. Yeah, I got it. But at some point, the acquisition core needs to understand these are just copy and paste exercises from one proposal to the next. Is that really what you're looking to spend your time reading for, proposal after proposal? So you want creative solutions, create the trade space necessary for contractors to propose and develop differentiated capabilities and solutions, and reward them financially for results by allowing them to charge price premiums. Allowing contractors to actually make money for performance is critical. There isn't enough money in the collective bottom lines of all the traditional GovCon contractors out there to make up for the waste caused by bad policy, bad acquisitions, and overregulation. So, when you really think about saving money, is it productive to squeeze the contractor's bottom line, or, should we be thinking about reducing regulation and all the bureaucracy that goes into every single one of these acquisitions? And good God, hold the acquisition officials responsible for performance and results the way you hold the contractors responsible for performance and results. Multiple year sales cycles are absolutely backbreaking. There's just no, businesses, we can't function. It's very, very difficult. How can anyone plan around uncertain multi-year sales cycles for the big programs that represent the overwhelming majority of budget dollars that are spent? The other thing is just better support and advocacy where it really matters. So just a little anecdote. So, the 2014 DIP note that was signed authorizing the U.S. military to go back into Iraq was absolutely silent on contractors. There are no security protections, no tax protections. And I got to tell you, just in all my engagements on the Hill and, with over at the Pentagon and State Department, nobody wants to touch the issue. It's crazy. We're literally thrown to the wolves. And then the final point, just small business contracting, totally broken. And this is coming from someone who was a small business. From what I know, agencies don't get credited for small business subcontracting dollars, small business dollars that are embedded within subcontracts. I think that's the case, if I'm not mistaken. The truth is that most innovation doesn't come from either the tiny contractors or the large integrators. It usually comes from the mid-tier, the guys who both have offer the flexibility and responsiveness of the smaller companies and some of the depth and resources of the larger companies. It's very, very hard to build and maintain a sustainable mid-tier business in GovCon. Very hard. Because there's nothing that actually favors those guys. I mean, we tend to exist in that sort of middle sphere until one of the big guys comes in and buys us, or we just can't grow because there aren't enough opportunities flowing through the system for us to build, healthy, successful businesses. And so the alternative being that we go out of business or, shrink down to being a small business again. So, when you're mid-tier, it's like there's this constant pressure to try to figure out how you can, prevent catastrophe. You're usually like one contract away from disaster. And yet we have these, big overhead structures we have to support. So somehow if the acquisition community could pay a little bit of attention to really where they get the true innovation, the truly creative ideas, and the quick flash to bang responses for, the solutions, products, and services they're looking for, I think it would serve the community well. So, I heard a couple of comments about protests. I know that that in the acquisition core, there's a tendency to blame the contractors for the number of protests that are lodged that slows these acquisitions down. I would just submit to you that you probably need to spend a little bit of time looking in the mirror actually on that one, because I think the problems begin and end with the government. I mean, first of all, when the Army, I can tell you because I've been on the receiving end of this all too many times. The Army thinks that a successful outcome in a protest is to take preemptive corrective action. I don't even get that. Usually the time that it takes to correct a poorly executed solicitation is increased exponentially in the Army specifically. I see it more in the Army than in the other services, from my vantage point, by the corrective actions that are taken. They maximize, first of all, there's no time limit on it. That's the first thing. Second thing is, or there are prescribed time limits, but no requirements. And usually the maximum time is taken. I've literally sat through years of corrective actions where, by the way, the Army's paying huge price premiums to an incumbent contractor, that stays in place, that gets the extra runway, on their contracts. In some cases, as long as the actual contract terms themselves. I can't tell you how many times I've seen this. So I have to start to question, how are the acquisition officers really judged? How is their performance rated? Is it just on, losing protests, the number of protests lost? And how does preemptive corrective action actually factor into their performance evaluations? To me, that's an acknowledgement that something went awry in the acquisition process. So, I really think that, one other thing that I would probably just challenge anybody who sort of works at a policy level in the acquisition world, challenge you to think about is really, up here, I think the intent is great. And, we come to these conferences and we hear all the right things. But in execution, are the contracting officers actually doing what you want them to do? And do the solicitations actually read well? And do they actually meet the intent? So just kind of a rhetorical question. How many RFPs, statements of work, evaluation criteria, proposal preparation instructions do the acquisition officials who are sitting in this room actually read? Maybe recently a little bit more than usual because it's gotten a lot of attention as of late. But I can tell you 5, 6, 7 years ago, people that I spoke to, the answer was not that many. So that's where the rubber meets the road. And that's pretty much it.
Julian, thank you. And really, I want to thank all the panel members for being very clear and very concise. We have probably 30 minutes exactly to cover a number of questions. We got a host of questions, some dissertations, but a host of questions, and we'll get to them one at a time. But I'd like to turn for the first question to Major General James Simpson. James?
How has the insertion of the service chiefs into the acquisition process helped or hindered being able to better operationalize contracting? That's an excellent question. And I tell you, I guess I would say it this way, the question needs to be, how has General Milley operationalized the total acquisition process? Because that's what he is doing. He is getting us to focus on future acquisitions for the next fight over the hill. how do we get them out more rapidly? He's asking probing questions to the POs that are in front of him, the contracting officers that sits in front of him and everything about, okay, then if you can't award it here, then what is the plan, so forth and so forth. In my opinion, this insertion of the chief into the process probably should have happened 10 or 15 years ago. We're spot on with what we're doing with that. And I can tell you, it has paid big dividends in some of the things I've seen in some of the AROCs and so forth and so forth. Ooh.
Very positive indeed. General Ham, sir, I'd like to take a moment just to recognize a person in the audience that needs no introduction, but General Solomon has worked on the Gansler study and done a host of things in support of Army contracting. And sir, would you have anything for the panel that you'd like to share?
It's the first time I've seen a panel of contractors smile. My first dealing in Carr probably remembers these days with a contractor when I was a captain. The contractor said to me, "What do you want?" And then I came back to him and said, "What do you want now?" But you guys had a nice smile. My question is, we didn't talk about it today, but I think it's one of the things that we got. It's more in the operational side and the service side. What are we doing with COR? Do we have a management system to keep them identified, to make sure my feeling and what I see is we've sort of put this out into the field and let the field commanders worry about it, and maybe there's not enough. James, you and I have talked about this before. What does the contracting command, when we did the study, Bill was in his current, his last position, so I'd like to see your views on that. Thank you.
Okay. Hey, sir, as you know, we don't award contracts now without a COR being in place. And what we do is with those CORs, the delegation authority, as you know, comes down from the KO. And each contracting officer, whether they're at the contracting dock or director of contracting at Fort Campbell, they know every COR on that post. And they should be getting, based on the frequency of the inspections, bi-weekly, monthly, or so forth, just based on the risk involved in that contract. And we've got a system in place, and I can tell you, sir, it's a system that's much better than it was 5 or 6 years ago, where we were just hitting and miss with CORs, even down range, when we change out down range, when we're doing the rotation of units down range. Back home, whether if they're coming from Fort Bragg, the MIC at Fort Bragg starts the training back at home station for CORs so that they can be ready and postured to go down range, sir.
General, if I could add, just if you don't mind me adding to that from a contractor perspective, we see a huge variability of CORs. There are some excellent, ACOs and CORs and folks out in the field doing really, really good work. But then we also see some that really have very little training. In some of the contingency environments in particular, they come in for 9 months. So they hit the ground, they don't really know what they're doing. It takes them 3 or 4 months to and there may be issues they're inheriting. It takes them a long time to come up to speed, and then they're already getting ready to rotate out. So, contractors tend to be there for the duration, and I think that causes a lot of unnecessary churn. So I do think there needs to be something about, more specifically training, especially, in the contingency environments. And I don't know how you get away from the rotational nature of it, but there definitely is some work to be done there. I think Julian said it. I think oftentimes you hear at the executive levels the commander's intense, but when you get down to the field, it gets into this audit gotcha mentality versus are we talking to the local commanders and really delivering a capability. And so I think sometimes we seem to have our priorities mixed matched, and that's why in my comments I talk about really being part of the total force. We need to be there as a capability provider, providing solutions to the commander, and not this kind of gotcha audit mentality. And so I think there's some work to be done there at that level for sure.
Julian?
So, when you think about the dollars that flow through some of these big procurements, I mean, they're pretty massive. And I'm not sure there's enough training out there to enable CORs who are often, mid-grade officers or NCOs to to make the kinds of business decisions that sometimes contractors need them to make, and to take the risks necessary on behalf of whatever unit it is that they're supporting to make them truly effective. My personal view, in addition to everything that Byron said, is that the commanders of the units need to be more involved and engaged in the decisions that the CORs are making. I can't tell you how many times I've heard, retired general officers come out and say, if I only knew then what I know now. They essentially are chief executives of big, financial machines, and yet very few of them really understand or appreciate the kinds of decisions that are being made day in and day out that operationally impact their units. And so I find there's very little discussion on that piece, that's the piece that often gets overlooked or ignored. It would be akin to me allowing one of my contract specialists to make big business decisions for my company that can have profound impacts on the future of my business, and not be involved. That to me is the analogy. So I think the CORs are doing fine based on what I think the expectations should be on them. It's where are the big decisions being made? Where are the risks being taken? Where is the understanding of the FAR, the acquisition system, and all the bells and whistles that go along with it? I would argue that those decisions really do belong at a higher level in the decision-making process in a given command.
Julian, thank you. And I'd like to add, Julian, your comments really hit home with the Redstone group. I think you almost got a standing ovation by your earlier upfront comments, and that's directly from the Redstone Arsenal team. So, Mr. Carr, sir, next question.
All right, I'm going to try and do something that I'm probably not prepared for, which is answer 4 questions at once. So we'll see how well I do. The question, and they're all kind of interlinked. It's about discussion that we've had about industry collaboration and openness and the age of the workforce, and then our unwillingness, if you will, or to how do we streamline the process. And then some of the other questions are about large IDIQs and embedded liaison officers under LOGCAP. So what I would tell you is we don't necessarily shy away. We don't use the term alpha contracting per se anymore. But what we're trying to do is put in place contractual arrangements that allow us to have contractors engaged early on in the process, so that we're looking at op plans. We're looking at the planning factors, as Kevin alluded to, that the contractors, because there are components, if you will, of the force, that they're the ones that can provide that information about how they're going to execute and really set the theater and do all of those things they need to do so the component commander has the right capability on the ground. So we're trying to put that in place. And one of the discussions we talked about is under LOGCAP 3, where we had a single provider, KBR, it's a single provider, what we're doing under LOGCAP 4 and then LOGCAP 5. And what I would tell you is under LOGCAP 4, the question asked is, do we have L&Os from all 3 companies based in each geographic combatant command? The answer is no. What we have done is gone to a regionally aligned approach where each one of the contractors has a region that was competed that they're aligned to that region. So they are integrated into that process. They are integrated into the planning process. I will tell you we have to get better at that. There's still a little reticence on some of the community, the planners, to allow contractors into the fold to do that advanced planning. Working with General Simpson, General Perna, and the Fords, we're trying to work to break down those walls. So I think that's going very well. But it is an iterative process that we have to go through. We have to make sure everybody's comfortable and then obviously follow all the procurement integrity laws that are out there. The other question really talks about LPTA. Is the government willing to start making trade-offs and looking at more of a best value source selection? I think the answer is yes. One of the things that we have to do is engage with industry early on and ask you, what can you provide us that will help us delineate between contractors? I hear a lot about innovation. Sometimes for me, I don't know innovation. Sometimes I don't see it. and that may be more an indication of my intelligence than anybody else's, but I need to know from an industry perspective, what are those things that really can delineate you and provide a better capability to the commander? And if we can articulate that, we will build it into the solicitation. We will build it into the RFP. But ultimately, it is the commander's decision. In many cases, sometimes those trade-offs are not big enough. But we don't like to say LPTA. We like to say technically acceptable low price. But I understand everybody's point on that. So hopefully I answered all the questions. Oh, the other one was large IDIQs. That is one of the ways that we streamline the process, frankly, is these large IDIQs. What we have to do is looking at building in on-ramp and off-ramp capability as we go through this, and also be committed to the fact that if a contractor is not, if we're not performing or the business arrangement isn't what it should be, we have to be willing to off-ramp and run competitions. It is time intensive, but we can't get ourselves locked into something just because we're unwilling to change course as we go forward. So hopefully I answered questions.
General Leonard, you have the next question?
Thanks, Bill. So the question is actually for myself and General Simpson, but I'll try. It says integration of industry and government in addressing current and future logistics may cause a perception of conflicts of interest. How do we move toward integration but keep a level playing field? And Jay's addressed some of that. Clearly, what you're doing with the log cap solicitation, what we've done with log cap geographic combatant commands. Folks, I'll tell you, we would not have been able to respond to the Ebola crisis if we didn't have people that knew Africa, that knew that in one part of Africa you got to take Malarone, but in another you take doxycycline. And if you miss, you're going to get really, really sick. That sort of thing. So that regional focus works. So I guess to answer the question, I'd say, well, you got to balance that conflict of interest with capability and knowledge of the theater or the region. Said differently, we're really talking about looking a little bit more like special ops and a little bit less like big, massive army. I think that's appropriate given where we are. My final suggestion would be, I'd love to see this, more partnership between CASCOM, the think tank, and SOCOM. Because somehow Hondo Gertz has figured out how to firewall this and get the best of ideas without violating any Procurement Integrity Act or anything. So my own view is that somebody down in McDill's figured this out for what it's worth. Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. General Simpson.
Great points there, Kevin. But let me say this also. Our task, as Kevin just said, is to set the theater. That's our task. And, we talked about that. We talk about that a lot with General Perna, but in setting the theater, we also have to make sure that we have that proper balance. But he's right. We have to figure out a way that we can set the theater without this procurement integrity thing hanging over our shoulders and everything. Because we got a lot of work to do downrange in setting the theater. And I think that this can be overcome with the right people in the room focusing on the problem, and it will be overcome. Cool.
Let me ask a question of all the panel. I'm just going to read this, but mainly focus in on the three folks to the right, if you would. Most of you are in the services sector as opposed to being in the manufacturing sector. Does the requirements and contracting process lean too much toward manufacturing than services? From General Swan.
You already lit up. You should take it.
I'll start. I don't mind. I think absolutely. I think a lot of the the way you evaluate proposals. I think services is different. I mean, I think you're looking more there. It's as Jay was trying to say, it's really hard to differentiate in some of these service contracts. So we got to think bigger about a capability. So it's more the past performance is important, but financial capability, specific domain expertise or regional expertise, as Kevin was saying. I think you've got to look more at capabilities because the services, change versus in a manufacturing, you're looking more at specifications or quality or, or schedule or production or whatever. So I do think there's the source selection side is significantly different, and sometimes hard to make those differentiated decisions. And then I would say, and then on the execution side of the house, I think a lot of our folks are trained in that, as Mr. Callahan was saying, kind of that factory floor kind of training on the audit side of the house. And I think that's a different mentality than when you're trying to do a service level. So developing the appropriate, audit plans, quality assurance plans, I think, have to be seen very differently. And I'm not sure we've got that balance right yet. And it does appear to be a little heavy centered around the production side of the house.
Before Julian, my view is there's no reward for innovation in the services space. You write it in and meh. So we're not generic. We're not all the same. Each of us have different capabilities, and yet we have a really hard time marketing that and getting that forward. That's all. Over to you, Julian.
Yeah, so I'll just add quickly to what Kevin said and then address the broader question. So, if the government tells us exactly how many people we need to do a job, then they ultimately get it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that there is no difference between the contractors. So to me, it kind of comes back again to this concept of performance-based contracts and defining the objective rather than the path. Because I think if left to their own devices, contractors would probably propose, service contractors would probably propose vastly different, work labor breakdowns and quality control plans and PMO teams and so forth to address a certain problem set, whatever it is that the solicitation calls for. So, that trade space just doesn't exist in service contracting. There's just no room to maneuver. And I think this stems a lot from the fact that, the Government Acquisition Corps is terrified of having to justify business decisions that are made to hire contractors at higher price premiums if they really truly in their gut believe that they're going to do a better job or they have better experience. And so somehow that needs to be addressed. To me, this is kind of a cultural thing that would enable acquisition officers to go out on a limb and solicit a fixed price lump sum contract that essentially solicited creative solutions to a problem as opposed to a solution that basically required them to hire X number of people with Y resumes to sit in those seats over there. I think that's the risk-taking, the business part that seems to be lacking in this process. And the FAR allows for all that. So it really comes down to, is the government willing to take the risks? Or is the government willing to take those, give the contractors the flexibility to propose those solutions? But in answer to that question, there's no question that the acquisition process is heavily tilted in favor of the manufacturers. I mean, just the fact that, we're seeing more and more solicitations on services that require ISO certification. I mean, really? I mean, we go through the ISO certification process not because we really genuinely want to have that big process architecture, which, by the way, costs a ton of money to support. It's because we're trying to check a box in a set of solicitation requirements. So really, is the government getting what it thinks it's getting when they require ISO certification? It doesn't seem to be. And then there are other elements of value engineering that we see in RFPs just make absolutely no sense. I mean, it just literally doesn't make any sense unless it is truly a performance-based contract. So it's kind of like neither here nor there. If there's an objective that's being defined and the contractor's being challenged to propose a creative solution to it that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, i.e. you're accomplishing the objective, then maybe value engineering requirements make sense. But if all you're doing is providing 10 people with a certain type of resume to go and deploy in XY environment, what do you need those elements for? It doesn't make sense to me. I mean, we're not building a rocket. So. Oh, the last point that I'll make is I also instinctively feel that the best, most talented acquisition people are not in services. The best, most talented acquisition people tend to be put on the big weapon systems, the big platforms. Understandably, I do get that. Like if you've got 10 people to choose from, who are you going to put those people on an air defense system or a contract for translators? But at some point, that does need to be addressed because you do ultimately get what you pay for.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
Okay.
Okay, I'll,
Phil, if I could,
yeah.
you guys, maybe General Simpson Yeah, in the grand scheme, how much are we talking about percentage-wise between stuff we're buying as opposed to services? I mean, is it a 80-20 split? I mean, that just a big hand wave. I know that's a big question. I don't know. Say again?
It used to be 60% services, about 40% major systems acquisition when I was still in the building. So, yeah, great question. Hey, next question. I'm going to read this, but we've had a lot of discussion about communications and transparency across our operations, and this one relates to both. And I'm going to open it up first for General Simpson and then others to respond. And it deals with transparency and the flow of information associated with multi-award IDIQ task orders. The current flow is from government to prime, and in doing so, sometimes that chokes off the rest of industry, and it may in fact choke off the subcontractors underneath that prime that has the IDIQ itself. So the question really gets at, is there a better way to do this? Can we actually publish those requirements in Biz Ops in order to increase awareness, maybe increase competition and innovation in some kind of way, or maybe find a better solution? And at the end of the day, it's all about a common operating picture of government and what its needs are and how that's translated to industry and influences our IRAD. Anyone, or General Simpson, comments?
Yeah. We're talking about, tell you, this was a long one. Okay. Multi-award IDIQs, the flow. As you know, the government to the prime, that's the way we normally work contracts, and the prime to the sub is we don't have what we call privileged relationship there. So what you're asking is, can that process improve, or is there a better way to look at the common operating picture and to look at the development process and so forth? And how do we get left of bang? I would have to go back and really do some research on this one, because I can tell you this is not the first time this one's come up to me, but the problem is that when you work with the subs, and we have a lot of issues with our subs and everything, but we hold the prime accountable for the subs, okay? We don't, the government, as you said, hold them accountable for the sub. Also, increasing awareness for competition innovation. That's what we're trying to get to, is making sure that we competition and innovation, and that is what we have to get to. But I'd have to go back and sort of do some more research on this one to make sure I give him the right answer on that one. Okay.
And I think the real key, as I read through it, is Fed Biz Ops.
Right, Fed Biz Ops.
Is there a way to put that in there as
right.
you publish it to the IDIQ? Anyone else want to comment on that?
It seems to me we started talking about Stephen Covey a while back, right? Jeff Sorensen.
I'll take that.
And we talked about begin with the end in mind. Well, Covey wrote The Speed of Trust.
Right.
And a large amount of what we're dancing around here is about trust, relationships and trust. And so I think if we can work through some of that, that will give us that velocity we need, that we have achieved on several different kinds of operations. It's just not common.
Right.
And I think that's what I hear the Army saying is we have to have that all the time. And when we think about future warfare, we darn sure better get our act together as far as working together. I'll stop there.
Kevin, great. I'd like to wrap this up. We have about 2 minutes left. I'd like to give each person about 30 seconds for any closing comments that you may have, starting with Julian.
Oh, God.
30 seconds.
30 seconds.
I'll cede my 30 seconds to Kevin here.
It's really an honor to be here. Thank you for this to the association, and we've all worked together. What's interesting is we've literally all worked together in one place or another. not usually the garden spots of the universe, but we do get to work together, and it is a privilege. And I do thank all the folks in this room for what they do every day. That's it. Thanks.
You know, my final comment is I don't want to leave the impression that we don't have good communication, because I think we really do. I mean, I think the industry and the government has lots of opportunity for communication, and it actually, to me, in the last 4 or 5 years in particular, seems to have gotten much better and closer. So I think we're definitely on that right journey. And I think, you know, we just got to continuously focus on reinforcing the good behaviors. And so some of our comments, you know, we like to beat ourselves up a lot, but the truth is we've got a lot of really patriotic people on both the contractor side and on the government side that are out there just trying to do the right thing for the mission. And I think we should all be look ourselves in the mirror and be very proud of what we accomplish, because we do accomplish some amazing things. And I'm glad to be part of this panel. Thank you, General.
I'd just like to thank everybody for the opportunity to talk, thank the other panel members. It's just a broken record. It is all about communication early and often, and I think we're getting better. I think the more we engage further to the left, the more opportunity we'll have to help minimize that risk to the commander, because it's all about them being able to manage the risk in the operations. So with that, thanks.
Jay, thanks. General Swan, would you pass on to General Ham how much we appreciate the opportunity to be here? And General Solomon, thank you for joining us. Just a couple of comments before I turn it over to General Simpson for the final word. But you can't separate requirements and contracts. A lot of folks have talked about that. When you do, bad things happen. Mm-hmm. And if you create a brick wall between the two, as Chris said, and you try to throw it over the wall, that contracting officer may be getting something that's broke before they ever know it. So it has to be a collaboration. And General Simpson is focused in on, it's not about actions and dollars. It's about the outcome that you have related to a warfighter requirement who needs something. You can do 90% of the actions in dollars, but if that other 10% is critical to the warfighter, then you've really missed the boat. It's about outcomes on that. Some of the other takeaways, contractors are not expensive, requirements are expensive. One of our teammates said that. Treating capabilities and requirements like an RFF. It's a need that the warfighter has at a certain point. A lot of discussion about innovation. Contractors at partners, and I think Kevin hit a really key point about trust. Trust between industry, between the contracting officer, the requiring activity, and that triangle that has to be so tight and to create that trust. Again, an honor to be here with you with this distinguished panel. General Simpson, final words,
Phil,
sir.
Can I take back my 30 seconds? Just real quick. Just one thing I just want to highlight. It occurred to me about a week and a half ago when I was sitting in my first AUSA forum, what a critical role the AUSA can actually play in this process. Because it seems like the barriers go down when we're in this sort of neutral territory here. So just want to applaud on behalf of, I think, all of us that AUSA's efforts to put this together. I really think that this is very productive, and hopefully we'll see more of them.
Sir. First of all, thank all the panel members, and sir, thank you so much. We talk about operationalizing contracting, but let me put it this way, operationalizing the acquisition process. That's where we have to start at, and it's a total process that we're trying to get at, as we talked about earlier with the chief involved and so forth. So that's what we have to focus on here. And some great comments from all of the panel members, but this culture that we've trying to drive is it can't be up here with General Perner and General Simpson. We got to drive it down to all of my acquisition professionals, and not only in the Army Contracting Command, the National Guard Bureau, the Corps of Engineers, MedCom. All of us provide great contracting support for our Army. And to industry, we drive that process down. That opens up communications where they're transparent, and that gives you an opportunity for the solicitation that you're going to bid on, not to be a C- product, but an A product. That's what we have to focus on. That's how we get everything quickly to the warfighter. So thank you so much. General Phillips, again, thank you, and panel members, thank you.